Hey folks, if you're looking for a brawler, a co-op title, or a new roguelite to romp through, today's episode may be of interest, since I'll be talking about Leap Game Studios' Tunche, which I was mispronouncing as Tunche for ages. In any case, I finally found an ample amount of time to sit down and play through it repeatedly, both on my own and with friends, all so I could answer the question: was Tunche a ton of fun, or was this hack-and-slash hackneyed? I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. Within the Amazon rainforest, a certain name is spoken with fearful reverence. Tunche, a great spirit believed to reside at the jungle's heart. It is thought that those brave enough to traverse those perilous paths might be able to prove themselves worthy, and in turn, convince Tunche to bequeath upon them a wish. The stuff of legends, really, because even at the best of times, that trek is truly treacherous, and in recent days only more so, as those paths have grown dark and overrun with monsters, even as the jungle encroaches the sparse villages scattered throughout. It's in the midst of this that 5 travelers move to make the journey, though whether it's fueled by determination or desperation is yet to be seen. Here's the thing though, the way the story is told and what it chooses to focus on can be a bit quirky, if only because it's entirely possible to beat the game a fair number of times, have the overarching story play out, and still find yourself missing out on narrative beats pertaining to the characters themselves. First off, the game doesn't provide you with an excess of details up front, contenting itself with a very cursory introduction to its cast and what they're doing, but leaving the crux of things to unfurl as you progress. Mostly, this takes the form of brief dialogues with the spirits you encounter in the forest, or characters you can rescue, who then show up in the camp as you progress. And on this front, the pacing isn't too bad, initially. The small tidbits of story you earn provide a nice incentive for progressing through your runs, whether you win or not. That said, while the progression through these segments is linear, the process of unlocking them is somewhat arbitrary, which means you can have scenes play out whose bits of foreshadowing have been long since spoiled by, say, beating the game. That said, while this can be a bit weird, the really unfortunate part lies with the characters' individual arcs. See, each of the 5 characters has their own comic book-esque story segments you can encounter, which provide the reason for why they're so intent on trying to meet Tunche. Now, recognizing these segments isn't hard. You'll see a book symbol amongst your room choices letting you know when one's available. That said, these also suffer from appearing on an arbitrary basis, to the point that 23 hours into playing the game, I started to find myself uncertain as to whether or not the Hat Kid had any story segments because I'd maxed her out and still hadn't encountered any. She does, by the way. Part of the problem here is the fact that each story segment is tied to a specific region of the game, and you have to earn these in order, so if you need the first part and don't get it in that initial region, you no longer have a chance of finding any story segments on that character until the next run, which gets really insulting when you need the last 2 story segments for a character, since there's no quick way to reach the associated area, and that can make trying to earn those bits of lore a bit of a slog. Oh, and the game punishes you for trying to abort a run if you've discerned you can't get the story element you've been searching for, since unless you finish a run by winning or dying, you don't get to bring back any ancillary lore elements you found or resources you've earned, for some unfathomable reason. I don't actually get why this is a thing, really, because you can bypass it by just sitting still and letting enemies punch you in the face. So, just why? Oh, and before you go, it's just lore, Arlie. It's not just lore. Collecting the first 4 parts of a character's story unlocks an additional boss fight for the character in the form of their dark alter ego, which is very challenging, but also a very enjoyable, unique boss encounter. Oh, And it adds a character-specific epilogue to Tunche's ending, which is nice given that the game's default ending glosses over the individual arcs of the main cast. So, yeah, there came a point where my time in Tunche devolved to some near pious praying to RNGesus, all in the hopes that the game might kindly grace me with a character story scene. And don't get me started on the auxiliary lore items and pages you can collect, since beyond boss drops, those are also RNG related. Instead, let's tackle the mechanics, because I'll admit that my introduction to Tunche's gameplay was fairly deceptive. At a glance, you can be mistaken for thinking that Tunche is a basic beat-em-up. Each character's initial array of moves is fairly basic, being a light combo, a launcher, a projectile attack that's limited by your MP, and a dash with iframes, with small differences emerging in their range, the speed of animations, and the damage they do. You also get a healing potion, but yeah. Then you start progressing in the game. Like many other roguelites, you'll be tasked with going through a randomized series of challenges largely composed of combat arenas. While some of these are run-specific, such as gold needed to purchase items at a vendor, or relic orbs, which provide the player bonuses, 2 of these are dedicated to meta-progression-oriented currency. Which is, say, you can ignore things that will help you in the short term in favor of empowering yourself for future runs, and honestly, it's fairly worth it, since the first of these currency, skill orbs, provide you the opportunity to flesh out each character by expanding their moves. While it starts out fairly basic, it won't be long until you get a legitimately solid arsenal of abilities, which provides a great deal of freedom for how to engage in combat. Bit by bit, you'll gain really distinct special moves for each character to spend MP on, as well as expanded projectile combos. This alongside better basic combat options to help link your abilities together, and an ultimate attack to seal the deal. This latter element, I should note, may be limited by a separate charge gauge, but this stops being a problem once you start figuring out how to style on enemies. Literally, since at this juncture the gameplay starts to feel a bit more like a spectacle fighter, complete with better room rewards at higher style rankings. Only, well, it's a bit counterintuitive on this front. For instance, weaving in different attacks isn't always an optional means of building style, especially in the case of lengthier ultimate attacks, where you can actually find yourself punished as they stop giving points midway through or even begin draining them while you're locked in. And the style meter does empty fairly fast. In fact, it's generally more efficient to scoop a few enemies into a basic combo, weave in a projectile, launch them, air combo them, slam them, and then repeat the process until an A or S rank is achieved. Most enemies are extremely susceptible to being juggled, and even those who aren't can still be made vulnerable to it in most cases. And really just, you can scoop up whole groups of people this way. Though, on the subject of vulnerability, it's not like you're exempt, since not only do you lack iframes, you're also susceptible to hit stun, which can make any prolonged attack lethal as anything. Oh, and for further insult to injury, your style rank tanks with each tick of damage. Tick, in case you were sitting in something like a pool of fire. This doesn't just suck due to diminished rewards though. Remember those relic orbs I mentioned a bit ago? While these can provide some powerful effects, like imbuing your magic attack with status ailments or granting you regeneration at low HP, or even HP back on kill, there is a vast number whose effects only trigger when your combo meter is at A rank or higher. Not only does this mean you're extremely susceptible to losing a large number of your buffs at any given time if you get dinged by an enemy, it also means they're fairly difficult to trigger on the game's bosses, since they can provide limited avenues to chain attacks together and may even have mid-fight pauses which will empty your meter out while they're invulnerable. Admittedly, the orb effects are rather potent, especially since they're gameplay elements tied to a meta progression currency. In this case, you can use that currency to permanently level a relic and greatly amplify its effects to disgusting run-altering degrees. Especially since I was able to beat the game long before I'd boosted a handful. Yeah, that's not to say that Tunche is easy. You actually start out pretty fragile at first, and each of the game's areas do have their own distinct array of enemies you'll need to figure out and adapt to. Actually piecing together the optimal ways to approach and disable them is definitely a learning process, especially in the case of the friggin' bats. A few of the late game enemies are a bit obnoxious for their habit of running away from you and spitting projectiles, which actually gets super insulting since they can wander off the screen, get knocked out there, or simply spawn there, which leaves you unable to do anything about them as they pelt garbage at you, short of spamming your ranged attack at them and hoping they'll die in a timely fashion, or simply waiting and praying them to poke out. Either way, it's murder on your style meter, which is why I hate the bad enemies, since they love running away from you and spewing projectiles. Made especially egregious, by the way, since they're poisonous, and poison is perhaps the absolute worst thing that can happen to you, since if you die from poison while equipped with the relic that revives you, you'll wind up permanently poisoned until you die permanently. Just fuck bats. That said, one element I cannot gripe about. The bosses are fantastic. While they don't change up between rounds, I still had a lot of fun learning the ins and outs of each of these encounters, and once you get the hang of them, they feel fairly balanced. Plus, it's extremely nice to then unlock the max health and damage boosts associated with each one. It's just very rewarding and helps the flow of reaching them and beyond feel a little bit smoother. That is, until you play in co-op. Now I should mention Tunche is specifically a couch co-op title, so I had to use Steam Share to pressgang a colleague from Summit Reviews into helping me. Thanks again, by the way, Deadguard, in case you're watching this, your suffering was appreciated. Still, that experience meant I got to see just how much the experiences changes up, and okay, so first off, with two people, it can be really tricky to get a good combo score, given it's a lot harder to group enemies up in order to ramp up your style. What's more, you likely won't scale quite as hard in power, meaning while you both gain meta progression currency individually, you don't share relics, meaning only one of you can benefit. This is then made even worse, since if a player dies, they'll drop every relic they have, and if a player has a duplicate of that relic, their only option will be to shatter it, since you have no easy or timely avenue to revive a dead player. Rather, the only way they can be brought back is through a fountain room, or by beating a boss, with them coming back at 20% health in the latter case. That said, this is a pretty damn rough prospect, since a boss in two-player co-op has twice as much health, which means the fights can drag out substantially if one of the players isn't as skilled or lacks a few upgrades. I mean, technically there is a token item you're supposedly able to use to summon a fountain room and thus revive another character at your leisure, but I never actually figured out how to activate these, and neither did my player 2. Still, while this can make co-op a bit of a frustrating prospect, I did appreciate the fact that it's there and that you even have the ability to exit the game mid-run, only to pick things back up and still be where you left off, and even have your player 2 be ready to go, if they're alive. That's honestly a lot better than a lot of roguelites that I've played. It's just, well, goddamn does it still piss me off about the inability to end a run early without losing all your resources. I said it once in story, and I'll say it again. This serves absolutely no purpose other than to pad the length of the game by denying you an accessible means of trying to get the story elements you're missing just a little bit faster. Anyways, at this point, I think I've largely said my piece about the mechanics, so I'm gonna move on to the music, and honestly, there's a lot of energy to it, which makes bouncing enemies around to it loads of fun. That said, the aesthetic element I have to praise the most is the visuals. Tunche is just, it's beautiful. It's a hand-drawn style, and it's so smooth, it's like playing an animated movie or a comic book that's come to life. I absolutely love it, and I certainly found myself growing ever fonder of the characters' overall designs, especially as I gained access to more of their movements, and by extension, got to see further glimpses into their identities. Also, the Hat Kid's smug dance is a treat to see. This praise also extends to the various enemies you'll encounter as well. Their attacks as well as their death animations are nice to look at, and the unlockable lore comics were nice to flip through, and I found myself reviewing a few at the lore NPC in camp just to see if I could pick out any new details. But yeah, that's all the finer points here, so let's take all of this and boil it down. And at the end of the day, I really do like Tunche. I think it's an interesting experience and one I enjoy playing. Yes, the way it tells its overarching narrative as well as the individual stories of his characters is flawed, but the actual mechanical meat of the experience was enough that I could certainly recommend it as a hit for playing through. At least insofar as its earlier run-throughs. Here's the thing though, the game does exist in a somewhat weird place as a roguelite for a number of reasons. First off, while you're given a number of reasons to play through the game repeatedly, it's largely to hunt down the lore elements, which is a process so arbitrary in nature that it winds up feeling more akin to padding rather than an element you'll unlock organically. When acquiring something you need to progress, a story feels like I'm farming for a drop in an MMO. In a single player game, maybe it's a little annoying. Especially when you then put in systems that punish people for retrying without dying. This annoying element is only further compounded by the fact that this essentially prevents players from interacting with what essentially would boil down to Tunche's post-game challenges, those dark bosses, because there aren't any modifiers or systems you can interact with that substantially change up further replays, beyond the introduction of those dark bosses. And they keep the true endings for each character locked behind them. I mean, yes, there is technically meta progression you can go through, but that just makes things easier. I mean, you can choose to ignore the relics, but there's nothing interesting in how your future playthroughs will go beyond hunting around for missing lore and praying your luck will be good this run through. It is just frustrating to an excessive degree, to the point that the road to its complete ending feels tedious and ultimately very flawed. Essentially, while the game does kick off with a fairly solid experience, I found its endgame misses the mark by a fairly wide margin due to a lot of unnecessary tedium baked into reaching its proper conclusion, ultimately reducing it to a fumble if you have any intention of seeing its true endings or sticking with it for a prolonged period of time, which probably makes this a little bit unique as far as ratings I've given a game go. But yeah, I did stick with it for a fair amount of time. I at least got one true ending. I'm happy there. And speaking of sticking with something, thanks to my Crit Hit Crew patrons, Greenwich Babby and Andy Noted for sticking with me, and also to Shrimp Mania for being my first patron and also being here for such a long time. And also, thanks to you folks for tuning in and watching. If you have something to say, leave a comment, and if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description. There's also a link to my Patreon if you want to see reviews early or just want to support the channel, and to my merch house for neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs, shirts, and mouse pads. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.